5 minutes to curtain.
Wait. I perceive that you've recently been to Costa Rica, you hate your feet, a rat bit you as a child, you're allergic to mustard, you were born in a Volkswagen, you have a friend named Betty who's fond of opera. With your good bag and your cheap shoes, you look like a well-scrubbed, hustling rube with little taste. Good nutrition has given you some length of bone, but you're not more than one generation from...
Okay, you're losing Sherlock Holmes and drifting into Hannibal Lecter.
Sorry. You have 2 tickets to the National Gallery in your pocket. You were at one time a cha-cha instructor in Yugoslavia. You drank a glass of water that contained your grandmother's contact lens. You once accidentally stapled yourself to a Swiss guard.
Stop.
Truth too hard to handle?
No, nothing you have said is even remotely true.
Come on.
You got everything wrong.
Allergic to mustard?
No.
But you hate it, right?
I couldn't live without Grey Poupon. Here's the problem, Gillette. You are a great actor who portrays Sherlock Holmes. That does not mean you possess his abilities.
Exactly the kind of deception I would expect from a man who has repeatedly grown and sold his mustaches to a secret society of vengeful women raising an army of giant bedbugs. A game of mirrors reflecting shadows of clouds, of mythological creatures spewing fog into a darkened alleyway
I'm begging you to stop.
So be it. Here instead is a show about me, the greatest actor of my generation. And now the mystery of the radio host with no appreciable insight, Colin McEnroe.
That's me, too. All right, so we are going to talk today about William Gillette. William Gillette, who was from the area. I'm sitting in a place that William Gillette would have walked by many times as a young man. He grew up over on Nook Farm, not too far from here. That's, of course, the place better known for Harriet Beecher Stowe and for Mark Twain. But Gillette was this amazingly famous guy. I mean, we'll talk about how famous exactly he was. And as I keep saying, as we get ready for this show, I mean, I've been thinking about this for a long time. I mean, he really is the reason we think a lot of the things that we tend to think about Sherlock Holmes. I think even Arthur Conan Doyle would tell you that there were so many things that Gillette did in bringing Sherlock Holmes alive, and alive pretty much at the same time as the stories. The stories had been out. Doyle had gotten... Well, anyway, I'm getting ahead of the story, and the guests are going to tell you the story. But, I mean, this wasn't some retrospective period piece at the time he was doing it. He was doing, really, Sherlock Holmes at a time when people had not all that long ago read him in the original. Anyway, as I say, I'm telling the story, and that's wrong. So let me tell you who's with us. Henry Zecker is a freelance writer and author of William Gillette, America's Sherlock Holmes, a very comprehensive biography of William Gillette. Susan Dollinger speaks internationally about William Gillette with a focus on his role as Sherlock Holmes. She's also a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, a literary society dedicated to the study of Sherlock Holmes. And Shira Cohen is joining us from the studios of New England Public Radio in Springfield. She is the playwright of Elementary, My Dear Fellow, a new one-act play about William Gillette. And I should tell you that will be given a professional reading, Elementary, My Dear Fellow, at the Mark Twain House. I believe is it tomorrow night? It's February 11th, whenever that is. Yes, Thursday, February 11th at 7 p.m. All right, so let's first of all just talk about who this man was. Shira Cohen, I'm going to let you start. So for people who've never heard of William Gillette or maybe know about the castle sitting down there in Hadlime, but not much clue else about who this person could have possibly been, just give us a thumbnail sketch. Who was William Gillette?
To me, he was the personification of Sherlock Holmes. He took Sherlock Holmes from Arthur Conan Doyle's books and made him real, living person. In fact, many people thought Sherlock Holmes was a living, breathing person. He was an enigmatic person, and that is indicative of his castle, which I saw many, many years ago when I was a child. And that describes his being. He was intelligent, an inventor, a superb actor in his day, yet quirky and naive, and an even mixture of those two.
And Henry Zecker, Gillette. See, I just did it. I conflated the two. Gillette played Holmes. We know, I think at least 1,300 times might be at the time.
About that, yes.
Yeah. So how famous did he get? I've had the sense that, along with maybe Drew and one or two other actors of the period, he was about as famous as an American actor could possibly be.
He was like the John Wayne or the Sean Connery of his era. He was one of the leading actors, and I think the most successful playwright. He was one of the actors of the transition, coming over from the age of melodrama into the age of natural acting. And you mentioned John Drew. There was also E.H. Southard, Minnie Maddern Fisk, Richard Mansfield, Otis Skinner, people like that. They were kind of transforming the theater from melodrama into natural acting. And his dialogue in his plays was famous for its more natural-sounding dialogue.
Yeah,
but he was a major star.
That's something I was going to get to later, but as long as you're on it right now, let's pause and talk about this. So that's great. So actually, a little while ago, I saw this play, Red Velvet, which is about Ira Aldridge, the first black actor to play Othello at Covent Garden. And I mean, not only was he revolutionary in that way, but as you're suggesting, I mean, Edmund Kean, and so those actors of the first half of the 19th century, the stage was done in this very mannered way. There were these hand gestures and flourishes and stiltedness. I mean, as much attention was called as possible to the unnaturalness of doing a play, and it was considered revolutionary for people to talk conversationally and to act as though they were just they happened to be up there on stage and you were overhearing them, and even up to and including the point. And I think this is something Gillette in particular did away with actors standing in front of the curtain between acts and just talking to the audience about the fact that the play was happening.
They would have a curtain call after every act.
Yeah.
And he was among those doing away with that because it broke the spell of the play. And another thing you mentioned the melodrama. The one writer said that the furniture acted. It was all grandiose. It was loud. It was big. And the gestures. You didn't just walk on stage and go, ah. You go, oh. I mean, it was all very melodramatic. Gillette's first great contribution was making the settings on the stage realistic. Mm-hmm. A home in the South looked like a home in the South after the Civil War or during the Civil War. The jail and Held by the Enemy looked like a real jail. He was very precise in setting up natural-looking stage settings, just as he tried to do with his dialogue.
And Susan Dollinger, I mean, one of the things that I keep saying to people, and one of the reasons I keep telling people we're doing this show, is that Gillette had so much to do with so many of the tropes and conventions that we now associate with Sherlock Holmes. Maybe you want to mention a few of the things that he added that don't actually appear in the Conan Doyle stories.
I can't.
You can't? Oh, well.
No, because Gillette is really an illustrative bridge between the illustrator Sidney Paget, who did the stories for the Strand magazine, and our American illustrator Frederick Dorr Steele, who did illustrations for various book compilations, but also the great color covers for Collier's magazine. Now, what you're probably talking about is the deerstalker hat, which was actually first depicted by Paget, although it wasn't mentioned by Conan Doyle. He's talking about in-ear-flapped traveling cap that's gray. Gillette's hat was gray. But the dressing gown is something that he brought in, but his style of dressing gown was modeled on Conan Doyle's for the Lyceum production, kind of silk brocade in a violet color. The one for the Garrick production in New York was gold and vermilion, and when the light hit him, he must have looked like the world's largest Christmas tree ornament.
And Shira Cohen, just even the title of your play, Elementary, My Dear Fellow, my understanding is that, once again, that particular phrase, or Elementary, My Dear Watson, doesn't appear in the Conan Doyle stories, that Holmes does at one point say elementary, but not that way, that this is another Gillettism?
He says elementary, and at another point, my dear fellow. He never says elementary, my dear Watson.
And so, Shira Cohen, one of the things that your play is about is kind of the evolution of Gillette as an actor, and then his decision to play this role. And the way that you tell the story is one of an actor who had become successful and then kept threatening to retire, kept announcing that he'd done enough, he'd played everything he ever wanted to play, and he was going to retire. And the last thing he gets talked into is this Sherlock Holmes role, which nobody has ever done before. Now, how historically on the nose is all that?
That's pretty true from what I've read and the letters that I've read. He kept retiring many, many times, I think, because he had an ego and he wanted to be coaxed back into theater, not that he ever really got out. And he was in his 40s when he was offered to take Sherlock Holmes and do whatever he wanted with him, kill him, marry him, do whatever. And he had liked Arthur Conan Doyle's style and his writing, and he said, okay.
So he decided that he would go along with this, and Henry Zecker. Therefore, I gather that some of the things that Gillette did with this role were things that Conan Doyle might not have anticipated. For example, and all of you will no doubt correct me if I'm wrong about this, but my sense was that although Moriarty does appear in one of the stories and then is referred to a lot in some of the other Conan Doyle stuff, that Gillette conceived of him as somebody who really needed to be beefed up, that Holmes really had to have this kind of ever-present nemesis who exuded a kind of menace.
He also had Moriarty as, I don't know, he almost comes across as more of a buffoon. Mm-hmm. I mean, a clown for Gillette to play off of. He doesn't really have, in what I've read and seen in the play, not really the snake-like, reptilian, sinister look about him the way it's described. And he doesn't come across in the play as the great Napoleon of crime.
Henry Zecker, how much controversy would there have been among, in other words, people absolutely loved these stories. The stories were incredibly popular. Conan Doyle himself was getting a little bit tired of writing them, so he'd killed off Holmes at one point. But how much controversy would there have been about the idea of having someone incarnate him? I mean, even today, whenever something goes from the page to the screen or the stage, people get a little restless, a little jumpy. They feel as though liberties will be taken or that some kind of sacrosanct ground will be trampled over. How much was that the case? How much ambivalence was there about somebody doing Sherlock Holmes?
I don't know how much ambivalence there was back then because Saintsbury played Holmes in England, in the United Kingdom, mm-hmm. in Gillette's play. He was but he did more of the provinces where Gillette appeared in the major cities. But Saintsbury played him very well too. But they played it, not that Gillette stuck totally to the Holmes of the canon, but much closer than many of today's actors do.
Yeah,
and the productions you see today, some of them have gotten really wild.
Mm. I get the sense, and I think it was in your book, Henry Zecker, that like even in one of his early performances in England, he made a speech to the crowd at the end about, whatever ambivalence that people in England might have had about this idea of Holmes coming to London. Am I making this up?
That, as I recall, that had something to do with the fact that the people in the back couldn't hear him.
Oh, that's what it was about. Okay.
Yeah, and they kept shouting to speak up, and there was stuff said about his American or New England accent, but by and large, the British loved the play. I think some of the critics were more harsher on it because it's really not a great classic play mm-hmm. as such, but the critics were a little harder on it, but the public loved it.
Shira Cohen, as you began kind of investigating this guy, trying to bring him to life as a character in a play, as opposed to a man who performed in plays, one of the things that I think you had to sort of do is figure out what there was something. One gets a sense there was something very outsized about Gillette himself. That he was a big, tall, riveting kind of guy. That he was mesmerizing and exciting to audiences in a way that Sherlock Holmes needed to be. Do we know that he was like that in the rest of his life, or was he a guy who just lit up on stage?
Good question. I think it's a combination of both. He was the first matinee idol, so the women fawned all over him. He was very handsome and tall, yet he was very insecure, and I think that's a description of a lot of actors. So they go on stage and they get that positive feeling about themselves. I think in his relationships with others, he was a very normal, likable person and somewhat unassuming, a nice person that they could relate to and not uppity like Sherlock Holmes.
And so Susan Dollinger, to what degree did it become difficult for people to tell the difference between Gillette and Holmes? I mean, we know that at certain points, maybe even in the present, there are people who think that Sherlock Holmes was an actual historical figure. But at the time, was there a tremendous conflation, or at least a confusion about where William Gillette ended and where Sherlock Holmes begins?
Not really, but it was interesting that people would come to the theater and, believe that Gillette and Sherlock were pretty much one person. He'd get letters saying, "Would you come and sit in on this murder trial and give us an opinion?" And that's pretty funny.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to grab a quick break here. We're going to come back with more of the story of William Gillette.
Plumes of smoke form perfect O's as you sit down and smoke that calabash pipe. If you had an eyeglass or checkered coat, but sir, that won't make you Sherlock Holmes.
All right, we're back. We're talking about William Gillette. Let me just tell you, in the final segment, the third and final segment of today's show, we'll get more into the other eccentricities, the other parts of his life, the castle, the cats, the little railroad, the patents that he managed to acquire, or for things that he invented, basically, innovations that he did. All of that is still yet to come, but we want to talk a little bit more about this intertwined relationship between William Gillette, the actor, and Sherlock Holmes. With us, Henry Zecker, freelance writer and the author of William Gillette, America's Sherlock Holmes. Susan Dollinger speaks internationally about William Gillette and is a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, a literary society dedicated to the study of Sherlock Holmes. Also with us is Shira Cohen. She is the author of the play, Elementary, My Dear Fellow. It's a one-act play about William Gillette. It will be performed tomorrow at 7 p.m. At the Mark Twain House. It will be given a professional reading, that is, Elementary, My Dear Fellow by Shira Cohen. So maybe one thing that we need to do, in the play, Shira has one way of telling the story of the first meeting between Gillette and Conan Doyle. And Henry Zecker, maybe you can tell the biographical part of this. When and how did Conan Doyle meet the man he had allowed to create Sherlock Holmes on stage?
Who are you asking?
Oh, you, Henry.
Gillette had rewritten the play based on Doyle's play a little bit, I guess, and he traveled to England with the written play in the middle of 1899, and he read the play to Doyle there at Doyle's home, and Doyle just loved it. But their meeting was at the train station, and the story was that Doyle was rather stunned to see Sherlock Holmes step off the train because Gillette looked so much like the part. And so that's when they met, and they were just lifelong friends.
And didn't, maybe this is apocryphal, but I thought Gillette, as Holmes, held up a magnifying glass to Conan Doyle's face.
The story was he held up a magnifying lens, put it up to his face, and said, indubitably an author.
Yeah.
Something like that.
So, Susan Dollinger, I'm going to ask you to get into an area of speculation that's hard to pin down here. But one of the things that I started to wonder, the more that I read about the relationship between Gillette and Holmes, is to what degree Gillette kind of boosted the Holmes story up to the place where it could and would endure. I mean, it's a hard thing to know. These stories were obviously very popular as novels and as stories, incredibly popular. On the other hand, you just wonder whether there would have been this long chain of Basil Rathbones and Jeremy Bretts and Benedict Cumberbatches and all the other people who've played Sherlock Holmes. This sense that he's kind of a character who never goes away. Do you have any thoughts about the degree to which Gillette gets the credit for that kind of popularizing?
Well, actually, Sherlock Holmes had gone away. He had died at the Reichenbach Fall 8 years before Gillette wrote the play. So the play that he wrote was more or less a memoir of Sherlock and dealt with the 3 days going up to Holmes leaving for the continent for the final meeting with Moriarty. And at that point, in the United States, he sold out every night of his run. He came over to London and sold out every night of that run. Conan Doyle, in the middle of all of this, began to realize that it was time to remilk the family cash cow. and rewrote his draft for the beginning of The Hound of the Baskervilles to feature Sherlock. But again, as a memoir, he had not yet brought Holmes back to life.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them made about $3 million off this. And my thinking has always been that had Gillette not taken over Conan Doyle's draft, rewritten the play, and had this enormous success, we might never have seen The Hound of the Baskervilles in that form and the rest of the books following after.
Yeah, so that makes me feel better about my own crackpot theory, that there is some way in which, without Gillette's kind of like the Apostle Paul. He's the guy who kind of spreads the gospel of Sherlock Holmes around in a way that it really can penetrate and stay there. So one of the things I wanted to ask you all about, and maybe, Susan, you can start. One of the things I think a lot of us had assumed is, well, we'll see photographs or whatever of William Gillette all got up as Sherlock Holmes, but we'll never really have a chance to see what it really looked like when he did it. And then in 2014, suddenly this thing was this 7-reel movie that was unearthed in France, I believe. Tell us about this movie.
Well, the movie is a version of the play, rather. I'm not sure what you want me to say here, Colin, to tell you the truth.
Well, first of all, I think most people don't even know what this movie is or that it exists or anything. Maybe you can just sort of give people a sense of what it was.
Well, they weren't even sure what they had when they first got it. There's a woman named Emmanuelle Berthault who was working at the Centre National de Cinema, and she got this canister, and inside it was a case of the Texas Cowgirl and some sort of German Sherlock Holmes film, and then 5 cans of reels of a duplicate negative of something named Sherlock Holmes with the word Gillette on it. So she got in touch with, what is it called? The Cinémathèque Française, Céline Rivaux over there, and she came over to see the people at San Francisco Silent Film Festival and said, so we have this film by someone named Gillette. Do we know who this is? And she got in touch with Rob Byrne, who is the president of their board, and he got in touch with my friend Russ Merritt, who's a Sherlock Holmes Baker Street irregular. And Russ said, what you've just found is the holy grail of Sherlockiana. It's the lost film of William Gillette. Mm-hmm. And indeed it was. And Rob Byrne, when he finally got a hold of it, had something like 114,000 numbered files, little bits of film that he was just making into, what am I trying to say? He's digitalizing it and cleaning up the scratches and cleaning up the dust. And what he had at the end of the thing was a pristine print that was almost a 2-hour-long film, starring Gillette, of course, and acting perfectly naturalistically as was his style, in the midst of a collection of people who are really doing it up brown, except for Watson. Watson is also playing straight. It's just a lovely thing to watch. We went out for the premiere in San Francisco and just had a ball.
Let's actually hear a little bit from the movie.
How do I know you've been getting yourself very wet lately? That you have an extremely careless servant girl and that you've moved your dressing table to the other side of your room.
Oh, Holmes, if you'd lived a few centuries ago, they'd have burned you alive.
Such a conflagration would have saved me a great deal of trouble and expense.
I'm wondering, Shira Cohen, what it's like when you're working on a fictionalized version of William Gillette to suddenly be confronted with him as a more physical reality. Did you watch the movie? Did you not want to watch the movie and see what Gillette was really like?
I did not want to watch the movie. I had him in my head from going to the castle 6 times, from reading his letters. I didn't want to mess with that. Mm-hmm. And this is the first time I've actually heard it, the excerpt that you just played.
Well, I'm sorry to poison the well, but you've already written the play, so it's not a big problem. One of the things you tried to do with the play too, and one of the things that I didn't know about Gillette was whether he had any other personal relations. I sort of picture him as this guy who just was all alone his entire life, running around the world playing Sherlock Holmes, and then ensconcing himself in this bizarre castle in Hadlime. But there was a woman in his life, right?
Yes, he was married for 6 years to Helen Nichols, and by all accounts of what I've read and other letters, not from her, but from other people, that it was a very loving marriage, and she died after 6 years. She was 28, 29 years old, and it really set his life into a tailspin for 5 years. He had been in a sanitarium, and he just stopped acting. So I think there was a good connection between them, and with his sister-in-law, his parents, especially his nieces, and his manservant, Osaki, who stayed with him for over 40 years. So he wasn't jumping around the whole world all alone.
Right. And so this Japanese manservant who becomes kind of his Watson in your play, right? Sort of the person who finishes his sentences a little bit.
Yes, and he comes from a very wealthy background in Japan, so he's not this lackey.
All right, we're going to have to take a quick break here. What's going to happen is some nice people are going to come on and talk to you about supporting this radio station and specifically this show. If you like this show, you should call. You should make a pledge. You should make your feelings known. It really helps us when you do that. So listen to the nice people. We'll be back with the stories of William Gillette as a man, as an eccentric man, as a castle builder, a trick player, and a patenter of theatrical devices.
Flame to Sherlock's pipe. Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Sherlock Holmes and Watson. They were detectives. Look at that poor troubled lad.
Judging from the temperature of these remaining crusts and the toothbrush fibers nearby, I deduce that the person who produced this show hurriedly consumed a peanut butter sandwich with black cherry jelly at 10:30 a.m. and then immediately brushed her teeth. It was Betsy Kaplan. And me, Kyone Wolfe. Greg Hill appeared in the intro and tweets for us at WNPR Colin. Our interns are Tiana Duquette and Benjamin Esty. The part of Bill Curry was played by Basil Rathbone. For show pages, articles, and videos of the Here and Now staff solving the case of the missing headphones, visit our website, wnpr.org/Colin. On tomorrow's show, Paula Poundstone. And now, back to Colin.
Yes, I will just say about that I thought I was going to have, and Paula Poundstone thought we were going to have like a 20-minute conversation in advance of her upcoming appearance. And it just kind of sprawled. We just kept talking. So it's a whole show now. I think you'll enjoy it, too. You'll hear her being very funny and at times very serious, too. She has both sides. All right. Right now we're talking about William Gillette. William Gillette, a Hartford figure, a Hartford native. In fact, his family tree includes Thomas Hooker to a certain degree, the founder of Hartford. We can talk about that if we have time. But he went on to be so much more, a real international acting sensation. The guy who breathed life into Sherlock Holmes, got him up on stage where people could see him. Joining us right now from the studios of New England Public Radio, the Springfield studios, Shira Cohen. She is, in fact, the playwright of Elementary, My Dear Fellow, a new one-act play about Gillette. It will be given a professional reading tomorrow night at 7 p.m. at the Mark Twain House. Also with us is Henry Zucker, a freelance writer and author of William Gillette, America's Sherlock Holmes. We're going to spend some of the time here talking less about the Sherlock Holmes part and more about the eccentricities that went along with this. Shira Cohen, in your play, and once again, I don't know how historically on the nose this is, but in your play, at one point we encounter Gillette, and he's living on a kind of a houseboat, and there's a cow on the houseboat so they can have fresh milk, and there's a piano below decks. Is all this true?
Yes, it's all true, weird but true, and a larger boat, actually a ship, went by and asked if they could do their laundry on Gillette's little dinky boat. And it was an oddity on the river, and I think he enjoyed that it was.
And that was before he took Sherlock Holmes, right? I mean, he was sort of between, yet he hadn't gotten into that phase of his acting career.
That was one of his many retirements. Yes, pre-Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, so he was just going to float around on that boat. So, Henry Zucker, we have to talk about some of the other eccentricities. One reason he would need fresh milk from a cow would be cats. So, this is a man who loved cats as a boy and who just kept right on loving cats. How big did his cat herd get down there in Hadlime, Henry Zucker?
As I recall, one writer counted 17 live cats. He also had, statues of cats, pictures of cats. He loved cats. If he went to a new theater, the first friend he made was with the house cat. But, they had cats because of mice. And he would get a bowl of milk, and he'd have a sandwich, and he and the cat would dine together.
And
he had pictures of cats instead of pictures of women.
And we talked about the his manservant may be actually too simple a way of talking about Ozaki, but his dedicated companion in many ways. And so, Henry, my understanding is that Ozaki's duties did include rather elaborate preparations for these cats and their meals. Didn't each one have his own or its own bowl?
I don't remember them having their own bowls particularly, but yeah, they did take care of the cats. He lived for a while on Long Island while the castle was being built, and Ozaki would be seen walking around the neighborhood with a cat or a couple of cats in a baby carriage.
And didn't Ozaki also ride a donkey?
He had a donkey. He used it to plow his garden, and he rode it to and from the castle.
Right.
And if Gillette was going to have an open house, a party for the local neighbors, he'd put stamps on the envelopes, and then Ozaki would ride around the neighborhood delivering the invitations personally. But he rode the donkey everywhere. Yeah.
So Shira, I know
the donkey lived on the bottom floor of Ozaki's little house, and Ozaki lived on the second floor, and the house is still there.
Right. So that was the sort of the nearby cottage that Ozaki had. Shira, I know that a lot of the trigger for you to write a play about William Gillette had to do with visiting Gillette's castle. So I mean, it's got to be the most interesting and eccentric piece of property that the state of Connecticut owns. For people who've never been there, Shira, give people a sense. What do you see when you go?
Castle is the correct term, although in those days they called it a gingerbread house made of stone. It is weird. It is exactly the way he wanted it because he designed it. Windows are strategically set so he could see people coming in. If he didn't want to see them, they didn't see him. And a lot is said about the house. And when I did research, it happened to be a wonderful day when the house was closed, yet they were doing renovation. And we got a private tour of the people doing the renovation, and so much about the stones and the cat pictures and everything. It was just wonderful.
And sure, when one is in the house, I haven't been for a few years, but my sense that's when I first had the sense, wow, there are some questions about where Gillette ends and Sherlock Holmes begins and vice versa. I mean, it's very much the house of a person who wants his house to be cleverer than the people walking into it. This house is full of gadgets and tricks and things that give Gillette kind of this weird advantage over his guests. I don't know if you want to mention a favorite one.
Yes, a favorite one was he invited his guests to help themselves for a drink at his liquor cabinet, yet he had this lock on it that he could release within a millisecond, and the guests would try and try and try, and none of them could do it as he's watching and getting a kick out of their suffering, wanting a drink. And he just got kicks out of strange things.
Yes, I mean, this is very much the house of an odd person. And Henry, I'm also wondering how much of that you think was influenced by his upbringing. I mean, one of the people that he encountered in his upbringing was Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, who, also had a penchant for sort of tricky houses full of all kinds of interesting curiosities, and also had a pretty impish way of going through life. There's the story that Shira just told. It's kind of the story of a guy whose almost childlike impishness never goes away, and that's a little bit of Clemens too.
That's true. They did a number of pranks together. They had a lot. They were close friends and had a lot of good times together. But Gillette always had a genius for engineering and architecture. He designed that castle. I mean, he designed every nail and screw and board in it. And he liked gadgets. He has, you mentioned earlier his patents. He has 5 patents. 4 of them are for date stamping machines that you'd use in a post office. And one was for the sound of horses' hooves, galloping or walking or doing whatever, that he designed for the theater. But he had a workshop in the castle. He loved tinkering with gadgets and things, and I think all the things he put into the castle were partly the result of that. In fact, the one mystery novel he wrote, The Astounding Crime on Torrington Road, featured a guy designing, inventing, building all these crazy gadgets, none of which worked. but it was a gadget kind of thing.
We've mentioned everything else, Henry, except I'm sure we haven't mentioned everything else, but one thing we haven't mentioned so far is the little locomotives. Maybe you can tell us, this is another Gillette obsession, was with trains, so he decided why not have his own trains?
He loved railroads from the time he was a boy, and miniature railroads had been around since at least just after the Civil War. These were common in England. There were some here, and he wanted one of his own, so he helped design it, and they built it down in the workshop there in Hadline. And it ran for, I think it was 3 miles around the castle grounds. And one of the locomotives is still is in the gift shop on display.
I think both of you, Shira and Henry, both of you in your respective works talk a little bit about what Gillette thought should happen to all of his stuff after he died. He was very concerned that I think one of the notices said something like he didn't want some saphead taking it over. But and I can't remember which one of you, maybe both of you mentioned it. Shira, I'll throw it to you and hope that it works out okay. Didn't he actually say that wasn't he very fussy about who was going to adopt his cats, and that he wanted there was some kind of a joke advertisement where he said something about he thought that somebody should be able to interview other cats that the prospective owner had previously had.
That's absolutely true, and that he would not permit his house to be sold or given to a saphead, and if he was alive, that definitely wouldn't happen. You think these are jokes, but I honestly believe that he meant them because he was a little strange. He knew, of course, cats cannot be interviewed, but to him they were just so part of his family.
Believe me, I know other people who would take this exact same position. And one thing that both of you deal with, and Henry, I'll start with you on this. I mean, all of this exists in a kind of apposition to probably who William Gillette was meant to be by his family, right? This was already a very old family. One side of it did include Thomas Hooker. It's in Shira's play, but Henry, I'll start with you. One has a sense that this was all of this colorfulness and adopting the vaguely disreputable life of an itinerant actor, no matter how famous and acclaimed, was something that he was doing kind of in the gnashing teeth, at least initially, of his family.
The theater was a topic of disrepute when they came along. Proper people did not attend the theater, or certainly did not become actors. They may attend, but the theater was looked down upon as a community of lowlifes. And what Gillette did, among a few others, like we mentioned John Drew and Otis Skinner and Southern and those people, they were gentlemen. Minnie Maddern Fisk and the other ladies were ladies. And they brought true respectability to the theater. But his family did not want him to go into the theater. And yet his father, Francis, who probably had the strongest objection, realized that was what his son wanted to do. He drove him to the train station and told him he hoped he would come back, to visit. And he gave him an allowance to live on while Gillette was in his apprentice stage, not making any money. So his father actually supported him.
So Shira, we're about to run out of time here, but one of the things that I keep coming back to is this whole question of why doesn't everybody know this story? I mean, it really is this kind of amazing story. This guy who comes from this very well-to-do and perhaps somewhat repressed Yankee family in Hartford. He makes this decision to become an actor. He becomes famous as an actor, retires repeatedly, and then is confronted with this opportunity to incarnate Sherlock Holmes and becomes an international sensation, a lifelong friend with Conan Doyle, makes the 1916 movie. But I think if you were to ask the average person in Connecticut or Springfield or wherever, if they knew anything about William Gillette, you might get the castle. I don't think you would get much else. Do you have any theories as to why this isn't just sort of part of our American storytelling?
Excellent question. I've thought of that so often, which is one reason I felt compelled to tell his story. And I hope he likes what I wrote. I don't have an answer for that, except many times he was quite shy, although under the umbrella of he had this ego while he was performing. I don't know, except maybe there weren't relatives to hype what he had done. His wife died. pretty much everyone else in his life had died because he lived to be an old man for those days. Yes, his nieces were around, but that wasn't their job to hype their uncle, so I don't know.
You know, Henry, we're almost out of time, so make this a short answer, but some of it may have to do. You were just rattling off the names of people like John Drew, whose names also are not well known. You know, Edmund Kean, probably the best known stage actor from, a 150-year span when stage was all there was. Maybe it's just the fact that the work of the stage is evanescent. It just evaporates after it's over.
I heard the impressionist Rich Little say, "You're only as big as the generation that remembers you." Furthermore, Gillette only made one film. People remember film actors, but you're not going to remember stage actors from 100 or 150 or 200 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. We're gonna have to wrap it up there. But Henry Zucker, thank you so much, and Shira Cohen as well. Go and see Shira Cohen's play tomorrow night at 7 p.m. at the Mark Twain House.
There's a case to be solved. Case to be solved. There's a case to be solved. Case to be solved. There's a case to be solved. Case to be solved. There's a case to be solved. Case to be solved.
Watson, I deduce that you have on your winter underwear.
Holmes, again, you mystify the mind with your splendid insights. How did you deduce such a thing?
You forgot to put on your pants.